Now I think we're going to start our panel discussion. Before we start, of course, a quick word on our distinguished panelists. We have already met the two speakers, so I won't say too much about them. Seated next to Mr. Jayasuriya is Mr. Matanda Wabuyele, right? Yes. He is CEO of Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Before that, he was the Chief Executive Officer of Export Promotion Council, a trade promotion organization based in Kenya. He has over 35 years of professional experience in transformational leadership, strategic management, corporate governance, trade and investment and management consulting. He also worked as Commissioner General for Kenya on 3 World Expositions organizing committees in Japan, Spain, and China. He was honored with the Presidential Award of the Order of the Grand Warrior by His Excellency, the President of Kenya, for excellent performance in export development and promotion. Now, seated right to Mr. Wabuyele is Mr. Jagdish Singla, who is Vice President of Nestle Sri Lanka. A chartered accountant by trade, he joined Nestle India Limited in 1990. From the very beginning of his career, he held important positions under finance in Nestle India's flagship factory in Morgand. Before moving to Nestle China in 1997, he later took on the responsibility of business controller for the milks and nutrition business in the Greater China region, returning to India in 2004, and now he is the Vice President of Nestle Sri Lanka. To Mr. Singla's right is Ms. Ursula Winhoven, am I saying you're right? Wijnhoven, okay. Sorry, Chief of Social Sustainability, Governance and Legal from the United Nations Global Compact. She is also a member of the office's executive committee. The area Ms. Wijnhoven leads includes all the UN Global Compact's social sustainability and governance platforms, including human rights, gender equality, peace, and the rule of law. She has played an active part in helping the initiative to grow above 13,000 signatures in more than 170 countries. Prior to joining the UN, she worked in law firms and government human rights agencies in Australia and the US. Sitting right to Ms. Wijnhoven is Mr. Colin Low, who is from the International Standard Organization, which is based in Singapore. Colin's work includes capacity building and engagement with ISO members in the region and strengthening relationships with regional partners so as to promote greater use of ISO international standards in the region. Prior to joining the ISO, he represented SPRING in the APEC and ASEAN subcommittees related to standards and quality. And finally, last but not least, Mr. Malik Fernando, Director of MGF Holdings, Dilma Tea. I'm sure you're very familiar with this company. I just had Dilma Tea this morning. It's a family-run company funded by his father, Merrill J. Fernando, and is now co-directed with his brother, Dilhan Fernando. The company is a global leader in tea and well-known for its innovative approach of adding value to tea whilst maintaining authenticity. He set up a company, Resplendent Ceylon, which develops and manages a series of boutique luxury resorts in Sri Lanka. I'm sure you might have heard some of the leading resorts and retreat based here in Sri Lanka. So once again, a warm welcome to our panelists. Finally, we can start our first round of discussion, and I want to base the first round of discussion on the theme of how important standards and regulations for your business or your organization. And I would like to start with Ms. Fernando, if that is possible. How important are safety, sustainability, and other standards for your company?
Thank you. Good morning. Clearly, you have had Dilma Tea this morning because you're looking very vibrant. So
thank you.
Thank you.
That's all right. That's the mystery why I'm feeling so fit.
I'm happy to be here. I'll try and stick to my 2 minutes. I think it's absolutely basic entry requirement for countries and retailers if you're shipping a packaged value-added product. Now, when my father started Dilmah Tea back 30 years ago, it was unheard of for a third world or a developing country to export anything but a semi-processed or unprocessed product. So when he decided to go fully value-added and branded, our packaging, our product safety had to be second to none. It had to be of the same standard of Nestle, Unilever, and so many other players in the field. So we couldn't pass the buck to importers or brand owners as many exporters might, who do the food safety and the other processes there. So we had to do everything here. So we didn't have any standards to adhere to at that point, certainly not locally.
It was back then? It was when?
This was in the early 80s.
Early 80s.
In the early 80s. So we realized that it was critically important for retailers, for the confidence of importers, and most importantly, for a fledgling brand. Because I firmly believe that exporting value-added, fully processed product from origin is the only fair trade. Everything else which is value-added and marked up overseas is not fair trade at all, even if it's got the supposed fair trade logo on the pack. So without these standards that we have to adhere to, which give us the confidence to invest in the brand and give retailers, importers, and consumers the confidence again to buy the product and to have a consistent quality, we would be nowhere. So for example, HACCP, food safety now has been folded into ISO, but HACCP then, we were the first company in Sri Lanka to go for the HACCP standards. There were no auditors here. We had to get auditors from the Netherlands to get accreditation. Ceylon tea, which is our raw material, fortunately has a long history of regulation, compliance. We have a Tea Research Institute, we have a tea board that's a regulatory body, we have stringent rules on child labor and on worker rights. They're heavily unionized, some might say too unionized. So therefore our core product, I think, through 150 years of standards was protected. But we had to focus on a lot of food safety and standardized process certification within the processing end, which was entirely due to the standards that we took up. And right now, I'll mention later, we are compliant with about 15 or 20 standards. That's in answer to your first question. The challenges.
Yes, I'm going to mention the challenges because you obviously started as a small company, right?
Yes.
Right now, what is the size of your company?
Right now, we have about 1,500 employees in processing, and we have about 25,000 hand-picking, roughly 500 million in terms of
so it's
US.
really large for medium
Yeah.
to large for Sri Lanka. So when you started, up till now, what have been the challenges in meeting all these sustainability
The challenges were to pick which particular standards we wanted to adhere to. So there was a multitude of standards on quality and on sustainability, not only country-specific, but even company-specific. One of the companies that we supply globally is McDonald's. The burgers may not be as healthy for you, but their tea is. And to meet that standard, I've got their standard here, the Supplier Code of Conduct, huge range of human rights, business integrity, environmental management, and so on. So we get audited. So when my father started the brand, before we introduced Dilmah, we went for private label, co-packing, and then we had the benefit of the factory audits that these companies did. But one of the challenges was which standard do we go for? Also, the non-availability of harmonized standards for a specific industry. So there is no standard globally for tea. So if you look at the EU, which has very stringent standards, you have to interpret in different countries what would apply to tea. Sometimes they're contradictory. We also have issues in terms of production efficiency because some standards actually, as I said, are contradictory. So you couldn't possibly ship the same product, although the tea was virtually the same. You had to have customized runs because of some of the complexities of these standards. Delays in updating us on the standards, they're not always available online. Delays in communication, so you end up with a fair amount of packaged stock which cannot be shipped or have to be specially labeled, and interpretation of these standards also can be a challenge. So those are some of the challenges which we've overcome by over certification. We've sort of covered ourselves on so many fronts, which gives us the protection we need.
Was that not too much cost, too much burden?
It was a tremendous cost, but I think when you're creating a brand, I mean, of course, we adhere to these standards over a period of 10 or 15 years, not all at the beginning. Ultimately, your intellectual property and your brand equity entirely relies on those standards. I was just giving an example to Kelvin of Samsung and the implosion that they've had. But if you have a fledgling brand like Dilmah, if it had early issues with food safety. Now, there was one case in point where, as I said, when we first started, even in Sri Lanka, the powers that be didn't want us exporting in value-added branded form because they said, look, you'll upset the multinationals. It's our job to supply raw material. They will stop buying our raw material if you compete with them. They stopped anyhow. But one of the cases we had was in Australia, where there was a case of sabotage, where they actually put some cigarettes into our pack and sold it on shelf. Fortunately, we were able to clear that these were cigarettes available in Australia, not in Sri Lanka. But if we didn't have that, backbone of standards, the brand would not be where it is right now.
I see. We'll come back to you in just a moment, but let's go back to Mr. Singla and hear the Nestle experience. How important are the standards and regulations, and how are the challenges in meeting them?
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Is it on?
Good morning, everyone.
Try to use this one, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Basically, picking up from where Malik left, where he talks more.
Please put the microphone closer
Hello,
to
can
you.
you hear me? Yes. Where he talked more about the food industry. I would say that not only in food industry, but in any industry, and for that matter, even in service sector as well, standards are important because, it is important that when a customer experiences your product, it meets his expectations, and it meets his expectations not only the first time, but every time when a product is bought. And that is where an organization's ability to deliver consistency again and again, same thing again and again, 100% right, is relevant and is important. And that is not possible unless you have clear standards, unless across the whole value chain, everyone knows what is supposed to be done and how it is supposed to be done. And again, we talked sometime about the cost of standards. I believe that over a period of time, once an organization has standards, it pays for itself. It brings in lots of efficiencies. It brings in a lot of reliability. It brings in a lot of credibility. If I can say, if you can give you an example of, let us say, being a finance person of accounting standards. Imagine an organization selling products across the world and trying to report its sales in the US by without any international accounting standards to some of the sales. No, the figures would not be credible. You cannot compare the sales of one company with another unless you are sure that yes, these have been defined based on certain standards. There is a credibility behind the figures. So that is where the role of standards, not only in food industry, I think everywhere is very, very relevant. And one should not see standards as a kind of a burden, or one should not see it as a kind of a cost. Rather, it is an opportunity, and it is actually bringing in more efficiency in the organization in the longer term.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for sharing with us the perspective from Nestle. I would like to turn now to Mr. Wabuyele from Kenya. And I would like to ask you how important are compatibility, sustainability, and protection of consumer interest for the export strategies of your clients?
Thank you very much. As you know, Kenya is one of the leading countries in terms of export of horticulture, also tea. As part of positioning ourselves in and mainstreaming our products into the global value chains, one way was to look at standards in the area of fresh fruits and vegetables, whereby as a country, both the public and private sector had to come together to see how they could meet the food safety standards, to sustain those standards, and also ensure consumer protection in terms of food safety. Some of the initiatives that have been undertaken include hazard analysis and critical path control point systems that have been introduced. We have also environmental standards such as ISO 1400. food safety standards, ISO 22000, and also quality standards that have been enhanced and inbuilt in what we are doing as a country. We have an association, food, fresh fruits and produce, which has ensured that most of the members who are small, medium, and small-scale farmers have been able to adhere to those standards. Through capacity building, we have been able to enhance the standards through the institutions that are in place that ensure that the standards are there. For example, KEFIS, which is responsible for sanitary and phytosanitary issuance of certificates in terms of compliance. We have the Kenya Bureau of Standards, which develops the national quality standards. And these two organizations have ensured that we are compliant. We also have the veterinary animal health standards through the veterinary entity that has been established. So overall, it is crucial that you need to have standards that ensure food safety, that protect the consumer aspect, and also standards for value-added products that are compatible with the international standards. And that's how we have repositioned our country, as it were, with the effort of public-private partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wabuyele. We would like to hear more, especially when you talk about public-private dialogue, which is, I understand, very important in this matter. But first, let me turn to Mr. Lowe, who is from the ISO. Tell us a bit about the ISO's work in this domain. I know a lot of people understand ISO, but exactly what you do, maybe there are misconceptions you can take this opportunity to correct, and how important are standards in improving the competitiveness of small and medium-sized enterprises?
Okay, hi, testing. Hi, and first of all, I would like to thank ITC for giving the opportunity for ISO to be here to actually share with you. And then I believe my fellow speakers has actually shared their view on why standards is important to the businesses. So I guess my role, as what the moderator has mentioned, is more to actually share with you what we do as an international organization, and as well as what we are actually offering to the SMEs and the businesses. So first of all, let me just share what ISO is. ISO is actually an independent and a non-governmental and non-profit international standards developing organization, and with a membership of over 160 national standards body. So there is only one ISO member in each body. And then through our membership in all the 160 over countries, we actually bring together the international experts to share the knowledge and to develop the voluntary and consensus-based market-relevant international standards. And then that codify or document the distilled knowledge of all the international experts. And regarding technology and products and services and test method and processes, etc. And then the standards are contributing to ensuring that products and services are safe and reliable and of good quality. And also the adoption of the good practices by the organizations and the businesses. So for the businesses, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, and such international arrangement helps to improve the products and processes, and also to enhance the productivity and also the competitiveness of the companies, and which in turn helps to benchmark products and services for the small and medium enterprises to compete with the bigger competitors, as what like Mr. Malik has mentioned when he just started the company. And then to help the small and medium enterprises, they actually use the standard to benchmark their company against the bigger competitors. And so most importantly, it is definitely a gateway to the global market and also the value chain through such international arrangement. And then on how ISO help SMEs, and there are actually a number of initiatives that we actually do to help SMEs to overcome the pain point, as what has been discussed earlier by Malik especially. And then first of all, we have a dedicated SME section, which is a web page on the ISO.org website. And then it's called ISO and SME. So if you log into the ISO.org website, you can actually just search for the SME, and then it will actually lead you to a web page with all the guides and publications and products dedicated to all the SMEs, and particularly to help SMEs to understand more about ISO standards, and also there will be some guides to help you to implement ISO standards of particular importance. And then aside from that, we also understand that SME always find it difficult to identify which standard, and also to understand what is even in the standard, because standards are not free. You have to pay to actually look at the standards, for sure. So in this case, we have interactive, we call it online browsing platform, where you can at least just browse through the important chapters of the standards, like for example the definition and also the introduction of standards, but you cannot have the access to the main content, which is actually not free of charge, as mentioned. And in ISO, when we draft standards, we are also committed to make standards easier to use for SME. So the committee members that is actually drafting the standards, they are actually often they have SME in mind, so that they understand they don't want to make the standards too burdensome to the SMEs. Like for example, the testing requirements, is that really necessary to have so many requirements, which become a cost and a burden to the SMEs? And also we have a whole range of case studies on the benefit of standards, particularly to the SMEs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will hear more from what the ISO can do in this regard in the next round, but we have to speak more briefly, I hope, otherwise we will not have more question from the audience later. Ursula, please tell us, how can standards and regulations ensure that firms incorporate social responsibility and environmental sustainability in their activities?
Thank you. Well, yesterday we were hearing about these Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in September 2015. And this is actually a really, really big thing that happened in the space of sustainability. And as a result of the adoption by all 193 member states of the United Nations of these 17 goals and 169 targets, standards on issues like social, environmental, and ethical dimensions of sustainability are really more important than ever. These goals involved also unprecedented level of involvement of the private sector and civil society, and so as a result it's really never been clearer that sustainability as an agenda is here to stay, and we're already seeing many companies around the world embracing sustainability agenda to a much greater extent than ever before. And one dimension of this is that increasingly stakeholders of all kinds are demanding to know what a company is doing to ensure its sustainability. And so we can see the trajectory here, and it really makes sense because, of course, companies are not islands independent of the social, environmental, and other kinds of conditions where they operate. So there's a much greater call for social sustainability, environmental sustainability, the ethical dimension, as well as financial performance. So one of the things that the Global Compact, which is the UN's Corporate Sustainability Initiative, has done is to really encourage companies to take a look at these Sustainable Development Goals and to take the opportunity to align their own longer-term corporate goals with these societal goals that enjoy this consensus around the world. And one tool that can help companies with this exercise is called the SDG Compass. It's at sdgcompass.org. And another remarkable tool, which I understand there's a session on at lunchtime, is the ITC Standards Map. This is really an incredible resource that the ITC has developed to help guide companies in identifying the voluntary sustainability standards that can help them to achieve their own sustainability goals, as well as to demonstrate to their customers and other stakeholders how they measure up against relevant standards. So I think a key thing, given how sustainability is really to stay here, is it really now is up to companies to decide, do they want to be a leader in this, an early adopter to seize the opportunities, or are they going to be a late follower? And so increasingly I think it's not really a choice. Sustainability is clearly no longer a fad, etc. And these standards are really helpful in helping companies to be able to not only to know and show basically that they're on the sustainability path.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wijnhoven. I think these are big, lofty goals, but we need to start early and get prepared for the future before it is too late. Next, let's talk about what need to be in place at the company level and at the immediate business level so that exporters can meet the standard for trade. And I would like to again come to you, Mr. Fernandel. You mentioned that sometimes there are too many standards, too many regulations. How did your company manage to navigate through this complex world?
I gave mine away.
Please take the other one, yes. I can't let go of mine.
I gave mine away. Thanks. See, as you pointed out, we sell in over 100 markets. So it can be actually a nightmare for compliance because all these markets have different requirements. So it requires a lot of customization and extra labeling. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, there's a bit of overkill because we've essentially adhered to so many food safety systems, ISO 22000, HACCP, BRC, that's the British Retail Consortium, FSSC 22000, then on quality management, environmental management, organic, religious, name it. So we've had to do it because you have to do it for maybe 2 or 3 countries and then that goes broader. So one way we handle it is by overcompensating. Then also by picking the most stringent standards, which obviously help with accrediting in countries which don't have as demanding a standard. Also a regular dialogue in market with distributors on changes, because again, as I said earlier, sometimes these are sprung on you. It can sometimes even be a non-tariff barrier. So we need to kind of preempt what's going on. And also to evolve our systems and processes, particularly in the field of environment, where we become more and more sustainable, irrespective of the standards, for its own good, so that when a standard does come by, we are ready for it.
Thank you very much. I think from the perspective of Nestle, Mr. Singler, of course Nestle is one of the biggest companies in the world, but you cooperate with many medium-sized, even maybe small-sized enterprises from around the world. How do you pick these companies when you are trying to incorporate them into your value chain? Do standards and regulations play a big part? Please.
Hello. Yes, they do. I would say that, when you talk about today's world, the threshold of failure is very low. 99.99% is not good enough. When you talk about the quality of products or compliance, I mean, we see a recent example where one of the mobile companies who sold millions of handsets had to recall just because a few failed in its battery. So having standards across your organization is not good enough. You have to have standards, you have to have credible business partners who adhere to your requirements, who understand your business, who share your values as far as business is concerned. And once we have those suppliers, of course, you need to nurture them. You need to ensure that their failure is your failure, so you have to make sure that they succeed, and they succeed in their value chain as well. So they have standards which are in compliance to your business requirements, and you have to nurture them, you have to help them out as well. It's not that they have to do it themselves. At times you have to hold their hands and make sure that they comply. Because another thing I would like to point out is that when it comes to compliance, I think monitoring is important, but gone are the days when monitoring is enough. We have to move beyond monitoring towards a kind of a compliance management or even compliance culture, where when we talk about standards, it is not the responsibility of a particular department or a few people, the organization, to ensure compliance. They have to move beyond that, and it has to be everyone's responsibility in his or her area to make sure that there is a compliance of standards. And that's the only way you can guarantee zero failure.
Thank you very much. Let's come to the Invest in Sri Lanka initiative, Mr. Jayasuriya, how do you set the priorities and support foreign investors to access the local technical infrastructure?
Well, Sri Lanka's main focus is now on developing special economic zones with state-of-the-art technology providing technical infrastructure to the prospective investors. The country expects to minimize the time taken to take off a project by providing readily available access to technical infrastructure. Sri Lanka has now connected with the CME V5, the submarine cable, the state-of-the-art submarine cable, which has linked with 17 countries and having landing point located in Sri Lanka. This will assist Sri Lanka in achieving its Smart 2020, the digital society goals, and promote Sri Lanka as a preferred destination in the region for data center operations. Also, Sri Lanka is setting grounds to support the investors by incubator facilities for their technical infrastructure requirement. And in this connection, we are also working with most of the private institutions that are representing the trade, particularly the IT sector, and also for BPO, and working with them, creating this BPO, the infrastructure incubators for the startups in the IT and BPO sector. And we will be entering into a BPO, entering into a PPP, public-private partnership with them, where the management will be taken over by the trade, the IT sector.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jayasuriya. Let me come to Mr. Wabuyele for the Kenyan experience again. Any good practices in terms of public-private dialogue that you just mentioned?
In Kenya, we have a number of institutions that the national body, which is the Kenya Bureau of Standards, works with. I think the Kenya Bureau of Standards sets up the infrastructure, but the private sector has come in to assist with the compliance assessment, surveillance. We have organizations like SGS that have come in to assist with inspection. We have a development partner called Trademark East Africa, which has come up with building infrastructure at border levels to ensure that compliance is adhered to, and also establishment of laboratories within the developed government, which we have 46 counties. So regional labs have been established, and some of these labs are being managed by the private sector.
Thank you. Mr. Low, again, what does the ISO do to assist developing countries in building their quality infrastructure?
Okay, thank you. And then I'm actually very excited to hear that there's actually a lot of interest in standards, especially from Kenya and also from Sri Lanka. So we are actually particularly very close with the Kenya Bureau of Standards, which is the ISO standards for Kenya, and as well as Sri Lanka Standards Institution, the ISO member in Sri Lanka. So actually, ISO is actually not a very big organization. We only have like 140 staff in Geneva and also in Singapore. So actually, we leverage a lot on the ISO member, which is the national standards body in each country, which is they are our touch point and represent ISO in the country. So apart from the developing the national standards, which is the mandate of the national standards body, and then this body, they actually have a national consultation mechanism to actually bring together different stakeholders from government agencies or with particular interests, as well as the expert in country, and also the businesses and SME in particular, to collect the national position and also the national command, which will be actually submitted to the ISO technical committee that is developing standards. So with that, we can, as what I've mentioned earlier, this is how we collect the inputs from different experts. And then on the other hand, NSB, or National Standards Body, also do the national adoption of the ISO standards. Because oftentimes the international standards, it could be actually based on a consensus, so it might not suit the need of every country. So in this case, the national standards body is able to adopt the standards and then apply some slight modification, but which is actually based on the ISO international standards, and then use it in country. And in another cases, it is always also due to the language barrier, because ISO standards are in English and in French most of the time. So in this case, let's say for Sri Lanka, SLSI, or Sri Lanka Standards Institution, can actually do the translation into local language if they wish. So, so ISO is actually very aware that this is actually a very important infrastructure for both ISO and for in-country. And then we have actually some initiative, like for example, under the framework of the ISO Action Plan for a Developing Country, we are planning a lot of a whole series of capacity building projects and technical assistance, as well as training, aiming at strengthening the NSB's National Standards Body and their ability to support the jurisdiction in country. And particularly, this is for the developing country, of course. And then for even the least developed countries, they might not even have the capacity to be a full member in ISO to actually enjoy the benefit of being participated in the ISO committees. So we have a new program, we call it a New Rights Pilot, to give these countries the new rights to participate in this committee, even they are not a full member yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Low. Ursula, how can firms, especially firms in developing countries, navigate through and conform to the wide range of targets in sustainable development? And what kind of role can your organization play in assisting firms in these developing countries?
Well, as has been remarked on, there has been a proliferation of standards, and there's really no reason to think, given sustainability is so clearly on the agenda now, that will change. So perhaps we'll see even further proliferation of standards. So in that kind of context, it becomes particularly important, even more important, for companies of all sizes to take a strategic approach. So we see a range of approaches, some companies embracing virtually all standards and some others embracing virtually none. So clearly a happy medium would be somewhere in between those two extremes, where companies identify which standards are most pertinent and strategic for them, where they can really get the most out of the commitment that they make to those various standards, and where they're best positioned to do their best to implement those standards. And once again, a plug for the ITC standards map. It really can help with this, particularly with that process of identifying, and it compares, I think, something like 210 standards. And so clearly, companies in identifying the relevant standards for them are going to want to pay particular attention to the ones that their stakeholders have particular interest in, and that perhaps help them connect to these international value chains that we were hearing about. And one of the reasons why this is so key, we find we survey our 13,000 participants every year, and year in, year out, they always say that the challenges in the supply chain are their number one concern. So there's a real opportunity here to use standards to be able to show how the company is doing in all these areas. I think another thing that companies can do is they don't have to be passive recipients of standards. They can actually engage with the relevant standards organisation, and potentially there are opportunities also to be involved in the development and improvement of sustainability standards, which can perhaps address some of the challenges and the opportunities connected with them. Another one is around opportunities to learn and share in connection with the standards, what standards there are, how they're implemented, how to meet them, etc. And for multi-stakeholder dialogue as well about the opportunities and challenges. So the UN Global Compact is just one example. We have 85 country networks around the world, including one here in Sri Lanka. And these can be great forums as well for learning and sharing about the standards, how to meet them, what kinds of resources are available to help companies and meet the standards. So that can help companies be on that continuous improvement journey. Thank
Thank you very much. That's already a lot of information to take in, but very helpful. Marian, you have been sitting here, you have been listening to our panelists. Do you have any comments to make as to what they have said, especially to the participants of this forum? Anything you would like them to take away from your part?
Is it working?
Quickly, yes.
Yes. Yeah, maybe to add to one element that has been mentioned several times, the problem of firms, in particular SMEs, to identify which standard to meet and to compare standards. Ursula has already referred to the ITC standards map. This area of providing information in a way that is accessible for the private sector, this is an area in which ITC is very active. We have an additional tool to the standards map on voluntary standards. We have the MAC map, where you find information on regulations. So there an exporter can see if I want to export, for instance, to my home country, Germany, which is the governmental regulation I have to meet. Another new project referring to Malik's comment on sometimes regulations change and we are not informed. We are currently working with the WTO and UNDESA on a system that pushes information to interested companies. So when a WTO member notifies in Geneva to the WTO, we change our rule. This is sent to a national center point in the country and from there to interested exporters.
So getting the right information and being active in the forming, in a setting of standards will be very helpful. So I think we can open up to our Q&A session, interactive session. If anybody have any comment or a question, now is the opportunity. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question? Yes, there is a gentleman in the middle here. I believe there is a microphone. Is there somebody to pass on the microphone, or maybe you would have to? Excuse me, can I have the microphone for the gentleman here, please? Because I asked him to ask the question first. Thank you. Yes, please. Young gentleman, please. Please run a little bit. I said it yesterday. I'm going to say it again today because we're running out of time. We just have about 10 minutes for the Q&A session.
Many workers, plantation sector workers.
Excuse me, where are you?
Hello? Yeah, I'm here.
Sorry, I said, yes, please give the microphone to this gentleman here. Who is passing the microphone, please? Yes, oh, gentleman, this gentleman, you can come to the microphone, which is, set up there. Here, thank you.
Thank you. I want to know from Mr. Jayasuriya, how can a foreign SME set up his business in Sri Lanka, for Sri Lanka only?
In what area?
In any industry.
Yes. Once you decide what investment you want to make, the best place and the first place that you have to approach is the Board of Investments.
Yes.
We have the one-stop shop. You decide, but the first step would be to incorporate your company, and you can do that there.
But first we have to know the rules and regulations. When I was in the day before yesterday, they told me there is no room for the SME, for the medium or the big companies. They can do business
You
here.
must ask the question from the authority that can give you the answer. The authority that can give you the answer is the Board of Investments.
Yeah, I was in your office.
Yes.
Day before yesterday.
Whom did you talk to?
Mr. Thanasen, or I don't know. And yesterday I visit also your store.
We have the one-stop shop there.
They told me $60,000 you have to pay a non-refundable amount for 1 acre land and $20,000.
Well, we are not talking about your question was not that. If you want to start the business, yes, you can start the business wherever you want. You can buy the land from the BOI if we have in the zones, but if you want to locate it anywhere else, you can go to the market and then buy a property. And when you purchase property, that has to be on a lease land.
No, for the Sri Lankan people only, not for the re-export otherwise.
Well, for the Sri Lankan people, is it in the food industry or hotel industry or
electronic industry?
Why don't you discuss with him after the session
Yes.
so that he can address all of the
I think
questions?
that would be best advice.
Yeah, I see that he
Thank
has
you.
many questions, but it's a great opportunity to connect and talk. So, okay, that gentleman over there, please.
Hello, my name is Imran. My question to your panelists is, are we seeing a disconnect between the standards and the businesses in the developing world? What we see is a lot of new standards being rolled out, and on the other hand, what we also see is a lot of businesses either going bust in the Western world, or bigger names in financial services also having complied with lots of standards, whether that is the Enron or various other scandals. Despite following so many standards, companies are still struggling to cope up with that. So what would be the advice from your panelists for the developing world, so that we're not just filling out paperwork for the sake of paperwork, so that standards are more meaningful, especially for businesses in this part of the world?
So how can standards be more meaningful? Mr. Lowe, you would like to pick up this question first?
Okay, and thanks for the question. I think there is definitely a role for SME in international standards development. And first one, we have to acknowledge that there is still a gap, despite we have a lot of effort that we pour into the developing country, but there is still a gap in developing country in terms of the technical infrastructure for quality that we have mentioned just now. That's why just now in the SME Competitive Outlook report, I think there is also a recommendation to invest into the technical infrastructure for quality. And the second one is that on the other hand, SME actually, there is a channel for SME to be involved into the international standards developing environment. So you should actually, like for example, participate in the technical committee in the national standards body in your country. And then the national standards body also can reach out to you through sometimes directly to get you involved in the committee. Or the second way, which is a more common way, is through the intermediary organization, like for example, the trade association or some other SME groupings. So through this kind of channel, you can actually get your voice heard in the international or national standards developing environment. Thank you.
Anybody else who would like to answer this question? Ursula, yes.
I think it's a really important point that standards are not an end in and of themselves. They're a means to an end. And I think, as I was mentioning a little earlier, increasingly stakeholders of all varieties want to know, does the company care about these kinds of issues, labour standards, human rights, environmental issues, and what are they doing? And so standards provide a vehicle to actually be able to demonstrate that. And it's crucial then to be strategic, not to necessarily strive to meet every standard that's out there, but to find the ones that your stakeholders really care about that will help you access those international value chains and national value chains.
Yes, Mr. Oviyela.
Yeah, the other issue about standards, particularly the Enron case, is good corporate governance. Is one aspect that need to be calculated in organizations. Otherwise, circumvention is possible through collusion, but adherence to good corporate governance is one way of deterring some of this fraud.
So indeed, it's not just the businesses that are concerned, but also the governments, the policymakers. Any other input for this question? Mariam, please.
My advice would be in any country that the private sector has to engage with this theme. It's not something you can avoid. But engaging also means to choose which standard is relevant for us, which one is a must, which one is a maybe, depending on my market, depending on my strategy. Standards will be related to your strategy. And the second point I would like to make is that I personally find these times exciting times because this world of standards is moving. Standards are being set in the emerging world. With the new demand in the emerging and the developing world of a growing middle class, there's also a demand for new and different type of standards, and the best response to those standards can come from these countries. So not consider to engage also in a proactive way. It's possible nowadays.
Yeah, so don't make it an obstacle, make it a solution. Be part of the solution. Okay, any other question? I see many hands. Are there any women participants who would like to ask a question? Did I see? Okay. Okay, there's the gentleman over there.
Thank you.
Please.
Again, my question is to Mr. Jayasuriya, not as the chairman of BOI, but as a government representative. Now, in Sri Lanka, when you scrutinize the statistics, the exports of SME sector is fairly low. Majority is contributed by BOI companies, multinationals, and few Sri Lankan large-scale companies. Now, one of the main reasons is the difficulty in complying or conform to the international standards because it's a very costly affair. So, SME sector, I think they need some government assistance to comply with these standards in terms of financial, technical support, and testing or R&D. Even the few government-controlled organizations involved in testing, they also charge fairly large amounts. Even to get a photocopy of a standard, you have to pay photocopy or a CD copy of a standard, you have to pay 4,000 to 8,000 rupees at SLI. So I think government intervention is really necessary. I know the government is doing their best to improve the export sector. But if you want to improve the export of SME sector, government has to look into this complying and conforming to standards by SMEs. How are you going to?
Yeah, I get your point. So, any response from the panel? Yes, Mr. Jayasuriya.
Thank you again for the question. Now, when you say SMEs, that also has a wide range of items as to what the SME would be. Now, I was making references earlier that with regard to the IT sector and BPO, we are trying to start our incubators, where the idea is for companies, as referred to by you, when they have no possibility of starting off on their own, for them to be given that kickstart so that they can have the first 6 months or 1 year operated from our center. Now, with regard to R&D, we do not have any facilitation, I must admit that. But we can also get people connected from the Katupatha campus who have been of immense assistance to most of these R&D projects, and they have their own young engineers who are involved in the R&D projects, so we can get you to meet them and then take off.
I see, Mr. Jayasuriya, you have very big responsibility, a lot of pressure, very big opportunities, but your job is quite tough. But okay, there is the gentleman over there in the back with the microphone, please.
My name is Fazal Mushin. I am the chairman of the Exporters Association of Sri Lanka, and we deal with a lot of SMEs.
Could you speak up a little bit more, please?
Yes, I am the chairman of the Exporters Association of Sri Lanka. We represent a lot of SMEs, and we also understand what the government is facing in trying to assist SMEs. But I reflect on Mr. Fernando's point is choosing the correct standard. One of the biggest problems is such a emphasis paid by different customers wanting us to comply. Yes, we choose the correct, appropriate standard, but customers keep wanting us to have various standards that are applicable to different markets. This comes at a cost, and this continuous improvement of standard comes at a cost. We cannot, I am from the private sector. I cannot keep relying on government to keep supporting us to comply. I like to see the buyers also understand our problems and see how they can compensate when they ask SMEs from developing countries to comply, because our prices are not going up and a lot of SMEs are facing financial difficulty complying to various standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sikla, would you like to address that question?
I think, again, I'll go back. Yes, there is a cost of compliance, but at the same time, as we said earlier, that it has to be seen more as business enablers. And these standards and compliances ultimately drive to a lot of efficiency, and we have to keep that in mind. And when it comes to, yes, that it is affecting SMEs, and that is where, over a period of time, the efficiency has to come in, and that should make up for this kind of increased cost. Having said that, when we say that the knowledge on what standards are to be complied with, yes, you have to find various avenues to find the right sources for those standards. Yeah.
Are you satisfied with that answer? No. He shakes his hand. He shakes his. Anybody else? Fernando, you want one quick comment, please?
I fully agree with what the gentleman said. There is an element of greenwashing or whatever you might call it, where foreign brands, particularly if you're packing for importers overseas, they pass down their ethical, social responsibilities onto you. This happens in the tea trade, where certain brands say we want to give consumers assurance that our tea is ethically produced. So they put all these standards on you, and they actually push the price down lower as well. So it's actually very, very unfair. I agree with you fully. So we've said at Dilma all along, this concept of the fair trade logo you have overseas is absolute bunkum. It's just a marketing strategy. The only fair trade is where you have brands of whatever the products, spices, cinnamon, tea, coffee, information technology that is fully value-added, branded and packaged here. Then you dictate your standards. Otherwise, what the gentleman says will continue to happen. They pass down all these requirements in terms of compliance, and then they'll still buy from someone cheaper and look the other way if they're not compliant. It's a very unfair world.
Anything can be done from, the international organization perspective.
I think another thing that we've been trying to do is
Please speak up
encourage corporate customers to work with suppliers more to actually help them around meeting these standards, particularly if they have specific ones that maybe differ from others. So I think there's a lot more potential for corporate customers to play that more proactive role in working with their suppliers and to help them meet the standards. And I think it's of mutual interest both to the suppliers and to the corporate customers to help them build up the standards and therefore better meet the standards that the corporate customers have. So I think there is a trend in this direction, but there's definitely a lot more that can be done.
I see. Thank you. Okay, any more questions? I think we have just enough time to go for one last question. Yes, that gentleman over there. Please go ahead. Is it not? Please go ahead. No, we don't hear you. Okay. Is there another microphone that's closer to you?
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I work at ITC. One of the things also in terms of, so we know that cost has gone up and complexity has gone up with the multiplication of standards. And this is weighs especially on SMEs. So there's a couple of things that we and other organizations, some of them on the stage here have tried to do, which is to try to work towards better transparency. So better information that's available freely, that can be accessed on the web or through mobile. Also to help to work with industry and government and companies to move towards interoperability so that the standards, we can see how they compare and how they work together. But also we have a secret plan towards to move, not so secret, to move towards convergence. So there's a lot of standards that provide for that provide for, let's say, consumer protection at a similar level. So can we move towards interoperability, comparability, and even convergence to make the job easier to reduce cost and complexity for SMEs? It's not an easy task, but there's many in the audience here and many on the stage who are working to do just that, to try to make the lives of SMEs easier.
Thank you. So that was just an additional information you wanted to provide. Thank you very much. I see here there's a lady who would like to ask that question, so I'm going to make that exception. Please, can we have a microphone here? So they're trying to find the right person to bring the microphone, or? Yes, this lady in the front row here. Thank you.
Thank you. Zahra from Morocco. I would like to ask to which extent a standard is a better service for international consumer and a non-tariff barrier? Thank you.
Did you understand the question clearly? Okay. So I'm not going to rephrase it. Who would like to pick this up? Ursula, thank you.
Well, just one comment I wanted to make is that a lot of research that both that we've done and we've seen other organisations do shows that actually emerging market and developing country consumers actually often care more about these sustainability issues than consumers in developed markets. So it's an assumption that maybe people have, which when you look at it, actually shows that these issues, coming back to what I was saying earlier about sustainability, this is just a growing agenda that people around the world care about, and all governments of the world now have expressed support for these sustainable development goals. So I think that trajectory is that these issues just are increasingly important to us all.
Yeah, Marion, please.
That is an important question, and one very important currently in places like Geneva, where people negotiate trade deals. There's a lot of research going on this, and so far we don't have easy answers to these questions. What we do find, and it's presented in the report, that when it comes to regulations, that the higher regulations are that firms find it harder to enter new markets or to survive, and in particular new entrants. Existing companies often are able to adjust and to meet the standards even if they change, but new entrants find it hard. We also see that markets with more regulation are more concentrated. So you have less players and they are bigger. On voluntary standards, like sustainability standards, there's very little research because we didn't have the data so far. And I think the evidence we just showed that that the costs exist, export revenues go down, more so for small and medium-sized firms. This is indeed a signal that they represent a barrier to trade.
Yes, Mr. Ovuyele.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. The debate that is going on right now with some lobbyists and voluntary standards, for example, the carbon footprint. We are threatened in developing countries where the argument from Grantive University is that the carbon emission in Europe from the greenhouses is 6 times more than the emission through the plane loads for taking flowers or fresh fruits to Europe. So how are we going to handle such a new requirement, which I think is a technical barrier?
Mr. Jasuria?
There is also another aspect of it that we are faced right at the moment with the promulgation of the WTO agreement. If we give special incentives for those people in order to maintain their qualities and standards, then if it is extended on the basis of a particular trade, that particular item in other countries would be subjected to certain countervailing duties, which we are facing right at the moment with regard to solid tires, which I think is not reasonable. So these are matters that has to be considered by the WTO in taking this the convention that are now coming to force forward.
So the international standards and regulations also need to be fair and inclusive.
Particularly with regard to developing countries like not only the Sri Lanka but also in the South Asia region and others.
Indeed, I think the discussion really hinges on many different factors and it can go very wide, but I think we are running out of time. I'm just going to ask each of you to give us one last sentence so that people can take away from your different perspective. Malik?
As I said before, I mean, for the development of our brand, adherence to these standards has been critical. And I think, as I said, it's not a matter of just compliance, but it also helps you in your day-to-day business and to develop the brand. So we didn't do it simply for compliance and to cover ourselves, so to speak, but to actually develop the business in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, and so on. So it's been very useful for us.
Thank you. Mr. Low?
And I just would like to urge all the businesses to actually view standards as a strategic tool for your business and be an early adopter. And the second one is actually you should be involved in the standards development process. It's really not so far as you actually imagine. Thank you.
Also?
Just perhaps to reiterate that standards are a means to an end, not an end in of themselves, and that the key opportunity is to identify the standards that will that are most strategic for your business, that your stakeholders care about, and to see them actually as a value add for your brand and business as well as for society.
Thank you, Mr. Singler.
Yeah, I think standards are to be seen as business enablers, and we have to see that how they help grow our business rather than seeing them as a cost or barriers.
Mr. Oboyele?
I think standards are critical for SMEs, particularly if you are looking at internationalization. It should be a way of life. You have to comply or else you can't internationalize.
Standards should be universal, but with regard to developing countries, there should be some special consideration that should be given. In saying so, I also would stress upon the fact that Sri Lanka has an industry, the garment industry, which has about more than 400,000 employees and more than 1 million dependents. And we have lost the GSP Plus some years back. And the reasons that were based when we lost the GSP Plus are not the reasons that are now considered to continue with this GSP Plus ban. I think that should be one important issue where they should consider, the authorities should consider, the world authorities, international bodies, and then give us the GSP Plus for us to be competitive.
Thank you. Marian?
I think in an increasingly interconnected world, standards and regulations are here to stay. As an SME, as an exporter, you have to engage with them. The better and the more strategically you do this, the more likely it is that you can export, the more likely it is you have an interesting position in a value chain, or the more likely it is that you manage to develop your own brand.
Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the close of this first session of the second day of this forum. I have indeed learned a lot, and what I will take away is that if you can't change it, live it, embrace it, and lead it so that you can benefit from it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks to our panelists. Thank you.